The colony was small, just a scattering of homes and farms built on the edge of a wild world. The people there were ordinary families, workers and dreamers who had come in search of a new beginning. They had left the crowded cities of the core planets to find a place where they could breathe free air, grow their own food, and live without fear of being ruled by faraway governments. For a time, life was hard but good. The soil was stubborn, and the weather was often cruel, but the settlers were determined. They built shelters, tilled the land, and raised their children under skies so wide that you could see every star. Each night, people looked up at those stars and felt both small and strong, knowing they were part of something greater. But then came the troubles. At first, it was a sickness, a fever that spread quietly through the colony, carried by something unseen in the water or the air. No one knew how it began, but within weeks, half the children were coughing through the night, and strong workers who once carried loads with ease could no longer stand without help. The colony's small clinic, run by a single doctor and a handful of assistants, was quickly overwhelmed. Medicine ran out. The doctor sent urgent messages to the central networks, begging for medical supplies and trained professionals. No answer came. The settlers still believed help would arrive. They told one another, "Surely the nearby worlds will hear us. Surely someone will care." But each day the silence grew heavier. Then, as if fate was not cruel enough, storms struck. The kind of storms that did not simply tear down roofs but pulled entire homes apart. Fields that had taken years to prepare were destroyed in a single night. Crops lay flat, drowned in water or burned by lightning. The colony's people, once proud of their independence, now felt only desperation. With no food to last the winter and sickness spreading, they had no choice but to send out another plea. This time they broadcast on every channel. Their message traveled across space, bouncing from station to station. "Please, we beg you. We are dying. We have no medicine, no food, and our children will not last another season. Please, if anyone can hear this, help us. Do not let us disappear." For days they waited. Then the replies came. But they were not the replies they had hoped for. From the wealthier planets came polite but cold messages. "Your situation is regrettable, but we cannot spare the resources. Our own people must come first." Others were less polite. "Why did you settle there in the first place? You chose this risk. Now live with the consequences." Some messages were not replies at all, but silence, a silence more painful than harsh words. It told the settlers that they were not worth the effort, not worth saving. Each morning, families gathered by the transmitter hoping for news. Each evening, they went back to their broken homes, faces heavy with despair. Parents tried to comfort their children with stories, saying that heroes always come at the last moment. But when they looked at each other, the parents' eyes showed doubt. Hope was fading. One night, the colony leader stood before the people. He was an older man, his face lined with years of labor, his shoulders bent from both work and worry. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the truth. "We have done all we can," he said. "We have sent out our cries. If no one comes, we must prepare to face the end together." The crowd was silent. Some wept softly. Others stared at the ground, unwilling to face the thought of their children starving or slipping away in fever. But then, a voice broke through the static. It was rough, crackling with interference, but unmistakably alive. "We heard you." At first, no one dared to believe it. People glanced at each other, wondering if it was a trick, or just their tired minds playing games. The voice repeated, "We heard your cry. We are coming." There was no signature, no official seal, no recognizable mark of any well-known world, just that single message. The colonists leaned close to the transmitter, asking again and again, "Who are you? How many of you? What can you bring?" The reply came after a pause. "Not many, not much, but we know what it means to be left behind, and we will not leave you." The words brought a strange mixture of emotions. Relief, yes, someone had answered, but also fear because whispers began to spread. Deathworlders, that word carried weight across the galaxy. It was a word spoken with a shiver, used to describe those who lived on planets so hostile that most beings could not survive a single day there. Worlds where storms could tear metal apart, where plants were poisonous and animals hunted even the strongest settlers. Worlds where survival demanded toughness that bordered on madness. Most civilized planets avoided the Deathworlders. They were seen as too wild, too dangerous. People said they fought too fiercely, cared too little for rules, and carried with them the chaos of the worlds they came from. And yet, it was them who answered. The colonists argued late into the night. Some said, "Better Deathworlders than death itself. We cannot be choosy." Others whispered, "What if they harm us? What if their help comes at too high a price?" The older man, their leader, finally spoke. "When drowning, you do not question the hand that pulls you from the water. You take it." And so they waited, caught between hope and dread, for the Deathworlders to arrive. Children sat by windows, staring at the stars, whispering that heroes were coming. Parents worked tirelessly to keep fires lit, to keep roofs patched, to hold on just a little longer. The signal had gone out. The answer had come. Now everything depended on strangers from the most feared worlds in the galaxy. The colonists did not know what they would look like, what they would bring, or if their promise would hold true. But for the first time in weeks, there was something new in the air, something stronger than fear. It was hope. The days after the strange signal were filled with waiting. The colony's people kept going to the transmitter, listening for another voice, another promise. They wanted details, a plan, something solid to hold on to. But the Deathworlders sent no further words. Only silence followed. It was not the kind of silence that meant abandonment. It was the kind of silence that meant movement. The colonists knew that somewhere out there, rough ships were being prepared. Engines were being coaxed to life, and people who lived in places harsher than anyone could imagine were answering the call. Still, fear and doubt lingered. At night, in dim shelters lit by burning scraps of fuel, people whispered about who exactly was coming. Some said Deathworlders were savages who lived like beasts, feeding on whatever they could hunt with no sense of law or order. Others said they were mercenaries who would help, but only if paid in blood or treasure. A few whispered darker tales, stories of ships vanishing, of worlds left worse than before after Deathworlders visited. But there were also voices of hope. A mother who had lost 2 children to the fever said softly, "They answered when no one else would. That must mean something." A young boy, too weak to play but still sharp in his thoughts, told the group around him, "If the strongest survive the hardest worlds, maybe that's exactly who we need." The leader of the colony sat alone many nights staring at the stars. He had seen much in his long life, and he knew the galaxy was never as simple as rumor painted it. He believed that those who lived through struggle carried a kind of wisdom others could not understand. And so, in his heart, he began to trust that help was truly coming. The wait stretched on. The colony grew weaker. Food supplies thinned. The sickness spread slowly but steadily. Every day mattered. Every hour mattered. People sometimes woke in the middle of the night listening to the wind outside their homes, wondering if they had dreamed the message. And then, one evening, the silence broke. The transmitter crackled. A voice, deeper this time, with the rough sound of someone who had spoken more to storms and machines than to crowds, came through. "We are close." Hold on, no other words. No promises of riches or fleets, just those 3 short sentences. The effect was like fire spreading through dry grass. Suddenly, the colony was alive with energy. Children cheered, elders wept, and families rushed to prepare whatever shelter and welcome they could offer. For the first time in months, people moved with purpose, not just survival. Yet fear still mixed with their joy. What would these people look like? How would they act? Would they treat the colonists as equals or as weaklings unworthy of respect? The night stretched long, filled with questions. The stars above seemed sharper, brighter, as if even the sky was waiting. And then, just before dawn, the first ship appeared. It was not a sleek craft like those from the wealthy planets. It was not polished or shining. It looked scarred, patched with metal that didn't match, as if every part had once belonged to a different machine. But it moved with strength. Its engines roared with a sound that shook the ground beneath the colony. Behind it came 2 smaller ships, equally rough, equally worn, yet alive with determination. The colonists gathered outside, eyes wide. Many had never seen ships land so close. They clutched each other's hands, holding children close as the ships descended. Dust and wind whipped through the air as the great machines settled. The engines went quiet. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, with a hiss, the first ship's ramp lowered. They stepped out. The Deathworlders were not the monsters the colonists had imagined. They were human, but marked by the kind of life few others could endure. Their clothing was stitched and torn, patched together from whatever material could last. Their skin bore scars, the kind that told stories of battles with both nature and man. Their eyes were sharp, scanning every detail as if measuring the dangers around them even here. They carried tools strapped to their belts, tools that looked like weapons, and weapons that looked like tools. Everything about them was built for survival. The colonists froze, caught between relief and fear. No one dared to speak first. Then the tallest of the Deathworlders, his voice rough but steady, said simply, "We heard you. We came." It was such a simple statement, but it broke the barrier of silence. The colony leader stepped forward, bowing his head slightly, his voice trembling but firm. "You came when no one else did. For that we thank you." The Deathworlder nodded as if no further words were needed. He turned to his group and gave short commands. They moved quickly, unloading crates, setting down strange-looking machines, and spreading out as if they had been doing this all their lives. The colonists watched with awe. These strangers worked with speed and focus as if every second mattered. They carried supplies on their backs that seemed far too heavy for ordinary people. They set up shelters from materials that looked broken, but locked together with surprising strength. They examined the sick, their rough hands surprisingly gentle, and gave out medicine made from herbs, powders, and things the colonists could not name. Children peered from behind their parents, wide-eyed, watching these scarred giants who had come to save them. Some children whispered that they were afraid. Others whispered that they wanted to be like them one day. Not everyone was convinced. In quiet corners, some colonists still whispered warnings. "Be careful. They're not like us. They are strong, but strength can turn against us if they choose." The leader heard these whispers, but he also saw something else. He saw how the Deathworlders did not rest, how they worked through the night under broken lamps, refusing to stop even when their own bodies ached. He saw how one of them gave up his own food ration to feed a sick child. He saw how another, wounded while repairing a roof, refused any treatment until every family had shelter first. He realized something then. These people understood suffering. That was why they had come. Not for gain, not for glory, but because they knew too well what it felt like to cry out and be ignored. The colonists began to soften. Fear slowly gave way to trust. Families who once kept their doors shut now offered water and blankets to the newcomers. Children who had hidden behind their parents now followed the Deathworlders, wide-eyed, asking questions about their worlds, their storms, their battles. The Deathworlders answered in simple words, often with a smile that was small but real. They spoke of skies filled with ash, of seas that tried to swallow whole villages, of nights so cold that only fire and stubbornness kept them alive. And when they spoke, the colonists listened, not with fear but with respect. The colony, once broken and hopeless, began to feel alive again. Not safe, not healed, but alive, because for the first time they were not alone. The Deathworlders had come, and they were not leaving. The first days after the Deathworlders arrived were filled with unease. The colonists had begged for help, and it had come, but in a form they had never imagined. These new arrivals were not gentle doctors from the Central Worlds or neat teams of aid workers with shining machines. They were rough, scarred people whose very presence reminded everyone of hardship. Their ships looked like they had survived a dozen battles and 100 storms. Their clothes were patched with mismatched fabric. Their tools were old and strange, some of them clearly built from scraps of other machines. To the colonists, who had always hoped for clean and polished saviors, this was a shock, yet from the first hour, the Deathworlders proved themselves. The storm-damaged roofs that had been leaking for weeks were patched in a single day. Wooden beams were reinforced with strong metal braces pulled from the cargo holds of their ships. The settlers watched in awe as one of the strangers lifted a beam so heavy it would have taken 4 men to move. He carried it on his shoulders as if it were no burden at all. At the sick clinic, the single exhausted doctor found new allies. The Deathworlders brought strange medicines, powders, herbs, and liquids that smelled sharp and bitter. At first, the colonists doubted them. But when fevers broke and coughing slowed, doubt turned into gratitude. One child who had been lying pale and weak for days opened his eyes and asked for water, after drinking a mixture the strangers prepared. His mother fell to her knees, tears running down her face, whispering blessings to the very people she had feared. The Deathworlders did not waste time on speeches. They worked silently, moving from one problem to another. They fixed broken water pumps, dug channels to redirect floodwater, and reinforced the colony's defenses. Their hands were rough, but their actions were steady, precise, and filled with purpose. But even as they worked, tension remained. Some colonists could not shake their fear. They whispered to each other, saying, "Look at their scars. Look at how they carry themselves. They are fighters, not healers. What if they turn on us?" Others said, "They helped the sick, they fixed our homes. How can you still doubt?" And so the colony stood divided, grateful yet cautious, hopeful yet wary. The leader of the colony saw this clearly. One evening he gathered everyone in the central square. The Deathworlders stood at the edge, silent, their eyes watchful but unreadable. The leader raised his voice so all could hear. "We asked for help. No one came. No one but them. Judge them by their actions, not by their faces. They do not speak much, but their hands have saved us more than words ever could." His words eased some hearts, but not all. The Deathworlders themselves seemed to care little for praise. They did not ask for thanks or rewards. They ate simple meals, often giving their portions to children and the sick. They slept in rough shelters they built themselves, refusing offers of softer beds inside the colonists' homes. It was as if they were used to living on the edge, never expecting comfort. One night, a storm returned. The winds howled and the rain came down in sheets, threatening to rip away the newly repaired roofs. The colonists huddled in fear, but the Deathworlders did not hide. They moved into the storm, hammering down loose boards, tying ropes to keep walls standing, and carrying frightened children to safety when homes began to crack under the wind. The colonists watched in awe as the strangers faced the storm head-on, their figures moving like shadows against lightning-lit skies. Not one of them retreated. Not one of them hesitated. When the storm finally passed, the damage was far less than it could have been. The next morning, families emerged to find their homes still standing. They looked at the strangers differently that day, not as outsiders but as protectors. Children who had once hidden now began to follow the Deathworlders around. They asked endless questions. Is it true your skies rain fire? Is it true your animals have teeth as long as knives? How did you survive? The Deathworlders answered with small smiles, telling stories in simple words. They spoke of nights so cold they slept in caves of ice, of jungles where even the trees could kill, of deserts where water was so rare that people learned to drink from stones. These tales, instead of frightening the children, filled them with wonder. The parents listened too, and though they shivered at the thought of such worlds, they began to understand. These were not monsters. These were survivors, people who had learned to live where no one else could. Slowly, trust began to grow. One evening, the colony shared a meal with the Deathworlders. The food was simple: roots roasted over fire, thin bread, and what little fruit had been saved from the ruined fields. But as they ate together, something shifted. Laughter returned, soft at first, then stronger. The strangers laughed too, their rough voices carrying through the night air. It was in that moment that the colonists realized they were not so different after all. But even as bonds began to form, the truth remained. These people had come at great risk, with little to give except their strength and will. Their ships were fragile, their supplies thin. They had no great armies or powerful machines behind them, and yet they stayed. The colonists could not understand it. "Why?" they asked one of the Deathworlders one night. "Why come here? Why risk yourselves for strangers?" The man looked at them with eyes that seemed older than his years. His answer was simple: "Because we know how it feels to cry for help and to be ignored. We will not let you feel what we once felt." The words struck deep. The colonists realized then that these people had come not for glory, not for reward, but because they carried wounds of their own, wounds that had taught them compassion in a way the wealthier worlds never could. The colony was no longer alone. But they were also no longer the same. Something had changed inside them. Where once they felt weak, now they felt stronger, carried by the example of those who had faced worse and survived. And so, even though fear had once filled their hearts, the colonists now began to believe in something new. They believed in the strangers who had come from the harshest corners of the galaxy. They believed in the Deathworlders. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest the colony had ever faced. The sickness had slowed, but it had not disappeared. The food stores were still nearly empty, and the weather grew colder each day. Survival was not yet guaranteed, but the Deathworlders did not give up. From morning until long after nightfall they worked. They cut down the broken trees left by the storm and used the wood to build stronger shelters. They dug deep pits and showed the colonists how to trap clean water. They repaired the colony's broken machines using parts that did not belong but somehow still fit. Their methods were not always pretty. The things they built looked strange, crooked, and rough. But they worked, and that was what mattered. The colonists were amazed at how much could be done with so little. Where they saw junk, the Deathworlders saw tools. Where they saw a hopeless field, the Deathworlders saw soil that only needed to be turned differently. They had a way of looking at problems from an angle no one else would imagine. But every task came with a cost. The strangers pushed their bodies far beyond what seemed possible. They worked until their hands bled, until their backs bent with pain, until their eyes barely stayed open. Some of them fell sick from the colony's fever, yet they still kept moving. When food was shared, they always ate last. More than once, a Deathworlder gave his share to a child and went hungry himself. The colonists noticed. And slowly their hearts began to ache with a new kind of worry. Not for themselves, but for their saviors. One day, a group of Deathworlders went out beyond the settlement to hunt. The colony had no more animals left in the nearby area, but the strangers knew how to track far beyond the safety of the fields. They were gone for hours, then returned carrying heavy creatures on their backs. Their clothes were torn. One of them limped and another's arm was bound in cloth where sharp claws had cut him. Yet none of them complained. They dropped the animals by the fire, skinned them with quick movements, and handed the meat to the colonists as though nothing had happened. When asked why they risked themselves so much, the answer was simple: because you need it more. The colonists were humbled. Many wept quietly that night, realizing the strangers had taken wounds so their children could eat. And still, the price grew heavier. The fever that had spread through the colony reached one of the Deathworlders. His skin grew pale, his breath shallow. The colonists feared he would not survive, but the others never left his side. They cooled his forehead with cloth, carried him to the sunlight, and whispered words in a language the colonists did not know. After days of fighting, he finally opened his eyes again. The colony cheered, but the Deathworlders only nodded, as if this was nothing new to them. Loss, struggle, sacrifice, it was simply life for them. The leader of the colony often stood in silence, watching these people work. He knew then that the galaxy had been wrong to call them savages. Yes, they were rough, yes, they carried scars and wore no fine clothing, but he could see the truth. They had hearts stronger than iron, and those hearts were giving everything for people they had never met before. But the price was not only in wounds and hunger, it was also in choices. The Deathworlders had little fuel left for their ships. They could have kept it, saved it for their return journey. Instead, they used it to power lights so the sick could be treated at night. They burned it to run heaters so the youngest children would not freeze. Every time the colonists tried to stop them, the Deathworlders only shook their heads. "What use is fuel to us," they said, "if those we came to save are gone?" The colonists were left speechless. As the days passed, the bond between the two groups grew stronger. No one thought of them as outsiders anymore. Children laughed when the Deathworlders taught them games from their worlds. Families shared stories by the fire. And when the storms came again, everyone stood together. Colonists and Deathworlders side by side, holding down roofs, tying ropes, and singing to keep fear away. But even as unity grew, tragedy struck. One night a fire broke out in one of the shelters. The flames spread quickly, fueled by dry wood and strong winds. Screams filled the air as families rushed to escape. Without hesitation, the Deathworlders charged into the blaze. They kicked down doors, pulled people from the smoke, and carried children in their arms. When the fire was finally out, the colony was safe. But one of the strangers did not return. The next morning, the colonists gathered in silence. The Deathworlders stood in a circle, their faces hard but their eyes heavy with grief. They did not cry openly, but the pain was clear. They had lost one of their own, and they bore it with quiet dignity. The colonists wept for them, and in that moment any last shadow of doubt vanished. They knew now that these people were not just helpers. They were family. The price of help was high. Blood, hunger, even lives. But it was paid willingly. One evening, as the stars stretched bright across the sky, the leader of the colony stood before both his people and the Deathworlders. His voice shook with emotion as he spoke. "You have given more than we could ever repay. You have bled for us, starved for us, and stood in the fire for us. The galaxy may call you Deathworlders, but to us you are saviors. Whatever happens, your names will live in this place forever." The Deathworlders gave no speeches in return. They only bowed their heads, and one of them said quietly, "We do not do this for names. We do it because we remember what it is to be forgotten." And those words struck deeper than any sword. From that night forward, the colony no longer saw themselves as victims waiting to be saved. They saw themselves as part of something greater, bound together with these scarred strangers by sacrifice, trust, and courage. The price of help had been high, but it had also built something that could never be broken. The cold season came and the winds turned sharper. The colony braced itself for the hardest months, but this time it was different. They were no longer weak and hopeless. They were stronger because the Deathworlders stood with them. The once broken shelters were now firm against the storms. Fires burned steadily in stone hearths the strangers had built. The clinic, once just a single crowded room, had grown into a proper place where the sick could rest and be treated. The fields, though not fully restored, had small patches of green where new crops had begun to grow. The colonists could finally breathe again. They were not safe, not fully healed, but they were alive, and life felt like a victory. Still, everyone knew it had come at a cost. The memory of the fire lingered, and so did the grief for the Deathworlder who had been lost. His absence was heavy, not only for his companions, but for the colony too. Children asked about him, and the adults spoke of his courage. His name was whispered like a promise that he would never be forgotten. The Deathworlders did not stay idle even in their sorrow. They kept working, teaching the colonists how to repair tools, how to hunt, how to read signs in the wind and soil. They knew they could not stay forever. Their ships were old, their supplies thin. One day they would have to leave. And so they gave something greater than medicine or food. They gave knowledge the colonists learned quickly. They had to. With each lesson, they felt less like victims and more like survivors. The children especially took to the teachings with eagerness, copying the way the Deathworlders tied knots, lit fires, and shaped tools. It was as if the strangers had planted seeds not only in the soil but in the people themselves. But outside the colony, the wider galaxy remained silent. No word came from the wealthy planets. No fleets of help ever arrived. The colonists had been abandoned by the powerful, and saved only by those the galaxy had scorned. One evening, as the fires burned and families gathered to share their meal, the leader of the colony stood again before them. His voice was rough with age but steady with truth. "We will remember this always," he said. "When we cried out, the galaxy turned its back. But these people who had nothing gave us everything. We will not forget, and we will not let others forget." The colonists nodded, their eyes bright with both gratitude and determination. They knew their story had to be told, not just here but to every world that thought the Deathworlders were monsters. The truth was clear now. Sometimes the ones feared most were the ones who cared the deepest. The Deathworlders themselves listened in silence. They were not people who sought recognition. They did not care for honors or songs, but there was a quiet satisfaction in their eyes, as if the trust they had earned was more valuable than any reward. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, the colony stood on its own feet again. The sickness weakened, the fields began to recover, and the shelters grew strong enough to withstand the harshest winds. The worst had passed. It was then that the Deathworlders began to prepare their ships. The colonists gathered, their hearts heavy. They had known this moment would come, but it did not make it easier. Children clung to the strangers, begging them to stay. Mothers wept quietly. Fathers stood with hands clenched, torn between gratitude and sorrow. The leader stepped forward, his voice breaking as he spoke. "You came when no one else did. You gave us more than we can ever repay. If you leave, know this, you are part of us now. This colony is your home wherever you go." The tallest of the Deathworlders placed a scarred hand on the leader's shoulder. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of truth. "You do not need us anymore. You are strong. You will live. That is all we ever wanted." With that, the preparations continued. Supplies were loaded, tools packed away. The ships, though battered, were made ready once more. On the morning of their departure, the entire colony gathered to see them off. The air was filled with silence, broken only by the sound of children crying softly. The Deathworlders walked slowly to their ships, their footsteps heavy, as if they too felt the bond that had formed. Before the ramp lifted, one of the strangers turned and looked back at the crowd. He raised a hand, a gesture of farewell. No words were needed. The colonists raised their hands in return, every single one of them. It was not just a goodbye. It was a promise that the bond would never be broken. The engines roared to life, shaking the ground. Dust rose into the air as the ships lifted slowly, climbing higher and higher until they became nothing but bright specks against the morning sky. The colonists stood long after the ships had vanished, the sound of the engines echoing in their hearts. They knew the Deathworlders were gone, but their presence remained. Their teachings, their sacrifices, their courage, these things would never leave. Life slowly returned to normal, but it was not the same kind of normal as before. The colony was stronger now. The people were no longer afraid. They carried the spirit of those who had saved them, and they began to tell their story. To travelers who passed through, to traders who stopped by, to anyone who would listen, they spoke the truth. When we begged for help, the rich worlds turned away. Only the Deathworlders came. They saved us, they suffered with us, and they gave us the strength to survive. They are not monsters. They are heroes. The story spread slowly, but it spread. Whispers carried across stations and ships, challenging the old fears and prejudices. Some refused to believe it, but others listened, and doubt began to grow in their hearts about what they had once thought true. For the colony, that was enough. They had seen the truth with their own eyes, felt it in their own lives, and they would never let it be forgotten. Years later, children who had once been sick or starving grew up strong. They told their children, and those children told theirs about the strangers who had come when no one else would. About the ones the galaxy had called Deathworlders, and so the memory lived on, not as a tale of despair, but as a story of hope, a story that proved that sometimes the most feared people carried the deepest kindness. The colony endured, and in every corner of it, in every heart, the same thought remained. When we pleaded for help and the galaxy abandoned us, the Deathworlders answered, and because of them, we lived.